Hello, and welcome to the first actual episode of Standby for Adventure. My name is John. I have an intro video that I uploaded earlier today, and today we are going to look at some character classes. One of the things in D&D, sorry, D&D 5e, and one of the things I like most about D&D is, especially in this edition, all of the different options. When I started playing D&D back in the old days, there were not very many classes, and it was always really cool when they introduced something new. Like I had, probably still have somewhere, the original issue that the Barbarian appeared in, and it was absolutely just a horrible ripoff of Conan. And you can still see a lot of that in the class today because you can still sort of mimic a Conan type character using the different subclasses and things. It's moved a little bit away, and that's actually one of the things I want to talk about here. So with all the different classes, and you can see here on D&D Beyond, which I've got open, we've got what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 official classes. And one of the things I like is that with this edition, there are so many subclasses that you really can kind of play almost anything. But sometimes there are issues that come up that a class isn't working quite the way you wanted it to, or you have a concept for a character that isn't quite fitting. At least not within the rules as written, and not within the subclasses as written. So, in some cases, that's not going to be a problem. And let me just illustrate this in one specific way. Let's start with let's start with a what was the class I was just thinking of? Sorcerer. So I was thinking of a sorcerer, and a couple years ago, I was playing in a 5e game with a friend of mine who was running in Waterdeep, and I had come up with a character using the Unearthed Arcana version of one of the psychic classes. I don't even remember exactly what it was anymore. And then when those psychic classes actually got released, I had to rewrite the character using the rules as they were now, and what ended up happening was something I really did not expect. And instead of the character I had being, I think it was a wizard or a fighter. I think it was a fighter, because we were in theory members of the guard, of the watch in Waterdeep. And when I rewrote the character, he was a Githzerai, which was very unusual, far traveler background, and he was a member of the guard, and he had come to the prime material plane, whatever, the realms, because basically his race thought he was insane, because instead of being lawful evil, lawful neutral, he was lawful good. And kind of a weird break, but he ended up basically being in exile and leaving. And when I rewrote the character, I tried to write him up as a Psy-Knight, and that didn't seem right, and I ended up landing on Sorcerer, Aberrant Mind, because it gave him all the abilities that I had wanted him to have, but in a completely different way than what the Unearthed Arcana had first shown me. So this character is somebody I had named Morn, M-O-R-N, and we can look at him, but it doesn't really matter, because what happened was I ended up taking spells and abilities and feats that reinforced this idea that he was a psionic character with a psionic background, and it worked out fantastically. He was still very competent as a fighter because he was using a spear, which he can still use as a sorcerer. He can still use some weapons, but his main thing is he's a psionic character who's capable of fighting and uses his abilities either offensively or to boost his physical powers. by making himself, oh, I forget what it was. Like he could make himself lighter, and so he could make himself faster. He could make himself. It was all sorts of different things, but the character itself turned out really amazingly well. I have far too many tabs open on my computer, but let me see if I can find more in here. And there's just a dearth of images for for the over here for the Githzerai characters. So I have one that's sort of a 3/4 looking away image. He's only 3rd level. I didn't actually play him multiple times, like not over the course of a campaign. It's sort of a pickup game. But if we take a look here, he's got a crossbow, he's got daggers, he's got a quarterstaff and unarmed strike. And then his spells, and this is where it gets really interesting, his spells are, in my mind, all psychically generated. So he has Blade Ward, Gust, which is kind of like a minor telekinesis or aerokinesis, something like that is what I would probably call it. Mage Hand, which would be true telekinesis. Mind Sliver, which is, again, a mental attack. Minor Illusion, which is to project an image out into the world that doesn't exist. And Prestidigitation, that does all sorts of different things. And the effects, and the GM was fine with this, and I would be fine with this as a GM, were all mental. They were all psionic. The spells he has, Arms of Hadar, so again, create sort of telekinetic arms that can whip around and do things and deal damage. Dissonant Whispers, very psionic attack. Mage Armor, again, sort of a psychic shield. And then Actual Shield, the shield spell. And he got 2 castings of shield spell, one as a... Oh, I forget if it was a racial ability or a... yes, it was racial. Racial ability, and one was from his class. So, really, pretty cool. Really thought that was a lot of fun, and very defensive, very competent in combat. So if he runs up into combat, he's got his normal 15 AC. All of a sudden, he can go up to a 20 with the shield spell that he can cast multiple times because he gets a free one for being a Githzerai. 2nd level spells, Calm Emotions. Again, just following the whole theme of being psionic, being able to influence people's minds. Detect Thoughts, again, being able to read people's minds. Enhance Ability, sort of like if you think of Shadowrun, they have the Physical Adept. That's kind of what I was thinking for that, but he could also cast it on other people. And Invisibility, so clouding people's minds. I thought I love this character. I just think he's so much fun because he operates as a fighter, basically, but he has a whole bunch of other support and offensive abilities that people might not expect. And this character was one of the things that really got me thinking about character classes a little bit differently, and that's what I want to talk about today. And in order to do that, I'll back up here to all the game rules and all the classes, and I want to quickly run through, and I'm going to go very quickly because I could make this video super long by going super in depth on all these different things. But if you look at a character or if you look at a class, or you come up with an idea for a character and none of the classes really seem to fit, what you want to do is hone in on the idea that is most important to the character and then figure out how to make that. Don't worry about what the class is. The class is only going to... we get stuck with these blinders on of, okay, a sorcerer does this thing, and that's all they do. But that's not necessarily the case. Artificer... I think they've covered some good ground in the Artificer with things like the Alchemist, the Armorer, Battlesmith, and Artillerist. And for these, I find them really great options. Like, all of them, I think, are either really cool conceptually or fantastic for role-playing. I'm playing an Alchemist in a Witchlight game right now and having a really great time with him. He's renaming I am renaming all of his spells, and it's to reflect that they're all alchemically created, and he's putting his branding on them. And then the other classes too. So if you wanted to have, say, you wanted to create a character who came to the campaign with a magic item, just any magic item. And maybe you're the far traveler background, and so you have some inheritor background. So you have something. And artificer is a great option for that because not only could it be a magic item that you have, but you can also create magic items to be even additional things that your character has. In fact, a good example of this is Taryon Darrington. Sorry, my cat has decided that he wants to be right in the way. Taryon Darrington from the first season of Vox Machina of Critical Role. He was supposed to be a rich kid who had everything he ever wanted, and Sam had written him up as an artificer because it allowed him to have all those resources and all those magic items and the ability to get more magic items just with a little bit of a change out. Really very, very fun. I think there's some room to be played around with the Battlesmith in terms of the little assistant steel defender that you have. I've got a character in my game right now who has a little gnome statue basically as his steel defender, and it's fine. I don't mind that. That's perfectly okay. Make it look like anything you want. It could be like homunculus sort of thing, or however you want to define it. It doesn't have to be a steel defender, looks like a dog with spikes on its back, and they say in the rule book you can have it look like whatever you want. But yeah, if you wanted to play a gunfighter, you could play an artificer artillerist. There's no official gunfighter class. You can use the Matt Mercer gunfighter, which is fine. But I think the artillerist is also very cool because it lets you have that flavor if you want it, just with changing some special effects, basically. And certainly with my background, which is very much coming out of the superhero genre. I was a huge Champions and DC Heroes player back in the day, and Champions specifically was an effects-based system. So you would build your powers by taking these various effects and making them be what you wanted them to be. In this case, the designers at Wizards of the Coast have already created the effects, and you're just coming up with or defining what they look like. And that's perfectly acceptable, again, as long as your GM says it's okay. And new GMs, especially, I would say, let your players do that sort of thing. It's all just make-believe, right? So let them kind of have a little bit of rope and let them make up whatever they want to make up, and they're good to go. It's not going to really mess with the rules part of it as long as all of that is still followed. I enjoy that sort of thing a lot. So moving on from the Artificer, we go to the Barbarian. So Barbarian is super cool. And I never used to like the Barbarian. There's a few classes that I was never a big fan of. Barbarian was one of them. But in 5th edition, I've fallen in love with the Barbarian. I started playing one again in a Waterdeep game, same GM, oddly. And I played a... a barbarian from a noble family in Waterdeep who was... Cat, stop, leave it, come on. Sorry, that's Peanut, by the way. Peanut is quite a troublemaker. He's now biting me. And, but the barbarian was a noble, and the reasoning I came up with behind this for him being a barbarian was not that he had been kidnapped and gone off and lived in the north as a slave and all that sort of stuff, the Conan background, but instead he was from a long line of former lords and conquerors and things like that. Sorry, my lamp isn't working. A noble family with all sorts of, they conquered and founded their house. But then since then it's been, tens and hundreds of years, something like that, and the house has grown soft. But he was born with too much fire in the blood, and he's just a berserker uh, barbarian, but he wears very nice red clothing, very fine, carries a big axe, and has a real a really bad temper. It's led to some really very, very fun sorts of role playing. Another example of something like that is, and I don't know if they carried it off quite as well as I would have liked to have seen, but the Yasha, the barbarian in the second season of Critical Role, her rage was supposed to be this cold, impressive, intimidating sort of rage that wasn't screaming, yelling kind of thing. And I think that is important to remember, because you don't have to be a yelling, screaming, raging, frothing at the mouth berserker. You could define your berserk as something completely different. One of the other things that I really, really liked, and I had come up with this idea even before it was published, was a barbarian using the Path of the Zealot, because I was trying to think of what class I would use to write up somebody like Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane, just a fantastic character. His whole visual and, I mean, the stories were super fun, very D&D. But I thought the best fit for him was a barbarian, because Solomon Kane often talks about his, high ideals and being a Christian man and yada 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 and following God's word, but then he would encounter things like the undead or witches or whatever out in the swamp, and he would go into these rages where he would lose track of himself basically and just kill. And Barbarian is perfect for that, absolutely perfect for that. So if you're looking to play something that's a little bit different than, say, a Cleric of War or a a fighter or a Paladin or something like that has some association with some religion or some god, think about maybe playing a barbarian of whatever type you want, whether it's the Ancestral Guardian, Battle Rager, Beast, Path of the Beast, Path of the Berserker, Storm Herald. It could be anything, and just the definition of it is your god is infusing you with energy, essence, or you are channeling that somehow to do something different, and that then opens the barbarian up to allowing for any sort of character background, which is very, very different than how the barbarian is normally presented. I mean, even looking at this picture right here, right? This is like some rough and tumble guy who grew up in the wilderness. You don't always have to have the Outlander background or the Hermit background or Far Traveler or something like that. You can really do just about anything. Just define how you're getting your powers in a way that's different than what the normal concept is, or what the sort of maybe even the intention behind the class was, right? Like play with that expectation a little bit. Think about how else you could use it. I've got an idea for a Warforged Berserker, and I wanted to take the wild magic path, and then have him be specifically have been created or groomed to be the bodyguard for a spellcaster, and then when he rages at high enough level, I think it's at 5th or 6th level, he would opt to always give his companion a spell level back, because you can roll the D3 and you get a spell of that level, or a spell slot of that level back. And I thought that would be very interesting. So he is programmed, quote unquote, to defend his partner, his friend, and he has abilities that allow him to do that and to allow him to buff his friend in a way that a barbarian doesn't normally get to do. Another idea was a Goblin Gladiator with the Ancestral Guardian path, where he basically summons up his pack of goblins, the spirits of his goblins, a goblin tribe to fight and help him and his friends in combat. Again, just play with the ideas, and this is kind of what this whole video is going to be about. For the bard, bards are such a wide net in terms, or they cast such a wide net in terms of their abilities. It's interesting that because they're so good at so many different things, that even if you do specialize in a certain area, you're still really pretty good at everything. I mean, I think it's sort of an open secret that the bard is probably the absolute best and most flexible spellcaster in this edition of the game. Probably not what their intention was, but that's how it worked out. I don't really have too much to say about the bard, but the thing to remember about the bard is it's not necessarily about music, right? Your bard could, instead of playing music when it offers inspiration, its bardic inspiration dice, could just say, hey, you can do this, like, you got this. You could just be a very positive person, or just know the right thing to say at that time to get you motivated to get that extra die. Same thing with, maybe he or she doesn't play an instrument. How about they, John? They don't play an instrument. Instead, they do poetry, or they do whatever. They could rap. Who knows? They could do anything, right? The idea behind the class is basically somebody who uses their voice to encourage and improve their companions' abilities. And that doesn't need to be them playing a lute or the panpipes or a drum or anything like that. Let's see here. We've also got the Cleric. Cleric is also pretty straightforward, and I think people think of them specifically as divine spellcasters, and that's really limiting them, because they are way more than that, and I don't think they talk about it enough. And I say that even as the first thing over on the screen here, the first header is healers and warriors. Clerics don't have to be the guy that the person that everybody goes to get healed. That's normally their role, but especially if you already have a cleric in your party who's doing that, or somebody else who's really good at healing, whether it's an artificer or a bard, or who knows, maybe even a paladin or a divine sorcerer or something like that, the Way of Mercy monk. Think about making your cleric more of an actual holy warrior. They're not going to be a paladin, but you're going to build that character differently so that they're going to have more offensive spells and not so much either defensive or healing. And a cleric can be super powerful. Again, looking at Critical Role, somebody like Jester. Jester is a fantastic character, just fantastic, because she is not a typical cleric in any way. She acts much more chaotic, and that's on purpose, right? Her god, the Traveler, is a troublemaker, is a trickster type, and I think she just did an amazing job playing and coming up with that character. But think about that sort of thing. Even what did Taliesin play? The not Mollymauk, his replacement character. Yep, the Furbolg that I can't. Caduceus Clay. Sorry about that. But he also took a new domain and thought it would be interesting to have this staff filled with bugs that he could release. It just fantastic stuff. Really super interesting. And I think there's a lot of room in the Cleric to be able to do other things. One Cleric I've done in older editions and in 5th edition is a Arcana domain Cleric who basically views all magic as the same sort of thing. So he is able to cast arcane magic and able to cast clerical magic and wear armor and be able to stand up in the middle of fights and have access to all this magic that other classes just don't have, at least not in the variety that clerics do, given the right domain. Clerics have a lot of roleplay potential in terms of what they're capable of doing. Druids I have never gotten. I just, for the longest time, they just don't click in my head. I didn't really understand them, and then just in the last few years I came up with 2 ideas for druids that I love. One is, if anybody ever read the old Warlord comic book, he had a companion in that who was a woman with black hair who could shape change into a cat. And I was like, like a panther sort of thing. And I don't know if she could turn into other things, I don't remember. But I thought, it would be kind of interesting to write up a character who specifically does that and is a druid, so closely affiliated with magic, closely affiliated with nature. I think I had maybe thought about giving her Fey touched, so she either was born there or raised there, and she had the ability to change her shape into animals. And so instead of the druid being like a defender of all nature, she was like an orphan raised by wolves, basically, right? And I was able to take the spells and everything she had and customize them to have her be more like Changeling or Beast Boy from the Teen Titans, right? So she was able to wild shape. She was Circle of the Moon because almost why would you be anything else? Circle of the Moon is so cool. And had the wild shape for that, but then all of her spells were things like Beast Sense, Animal Friendship, all the animal spells, communicate with animals, speak with animals, that sort of thing. And stick with that theme as much as possible. I think if I played her long enough, eventually I would have had to have sort of branched out a little bit into other things, but that also makes sense to me, for her as a character, because I sort of viewed it as her naturally developing her powers as a shapeshifter and using the magic to be able to shapeshift, and then as she learned more about where these powers come from, this magic comes from, she's able to manipulate it in different ways. And it made for a really interesting character because at lower levels she was a certain thing, and she was the character who would turn into a panther or a tiger or a hyena or whatever and fight that way. And then once she got higher in levels, she had more options to be able to do things. There are some great druids here. The other one that I came up with, and this could be for any sort of druid, but he approached being a druid like people approach being a magic user. So he studied the old magic, quote unquote. He studied the original magic, and think of it sort of like Gandalf kind of character. Like he was called a wizard, but he was absolutely a druid. At the very least, he was probably a higher level druid than he was a wizard, if he was wizard at all, because druids have access to a lot of the same sorts of effects that Gandalf used. And so anyway, this character, it was in sort of a Strixhaven, Harry Potter, Hogwarts kind of setting. Like we were in a school, and I said, yep, this is where I'm going to use this character. And he was an academic. He studied books. He went to the library to research spells. He wasn't out in nature. He wasn't really a nature guy. He would go and see animals at the menagerie that was in town in order to study them and be able to turn into them with his wild shape ability. But he could be of any of the druid or circles, and any of them would make sense. When he performs a spell, he thinks of it as going through the steps of some small little ritual to get an effect. That's it. He didn't even have a god that he worshipped. He mimicked whatever somebody who was a follower of that god would do to summon up that spell and have that effect. And I think it's the first druid, well, the second druid, that really I liked a lot, because it was something a little bit different and kind of played with your expectations about what a druid was. Again, think about how you can change what's expected. Fighters are very straightforward, and they are supposed to be straightforward, and there are certainly options within the fighter subclasses to give you some really fun, neat abilities. I absolutely recommend it as a first-time player. If you want to play something pretty straightforward and basic, start with a champion fighter, because you will be effective, you will be able to do things, the rules will not be overwhelming, and then eventually you can spread out into other classes, or talk to your GM and maybe they'll allow you to change your subclass because you want to try something else, and that sort of thing I think is fine, because ultimately what you're trying to do is let everybody at the table have fun, and especially for new players. New players are going to want to experiment. They're going to want to do things. They're going to do things wrong, which is fine, because you find super interesting things that you wouldn't expect otherwise. But yeah, just play with that expectation and see what you can do with a fighter that would make it something different. There is a gunslinger now. Obviously, that's Mercer's addition to the fighter subclasses. Psy Warrior is pretty cool. The Rune Knight is very, very neat. I wish there were more runes for the Rune Knight. I would love to see more options for that. Battle Master is also very, very cool. I'm so interested to play one of those, and I haven't had a chance yet. I tend personally to like spellcasters, because if I'm going to play in a game that has magic, I want to use magic, right? Like, that's part of the fun. Like, they break all the rules when you have magic, but they've now introduced enough subclasses that any class can break the rules in interesting ways. And I say break the rules. They can do things that aren't normally allowed, is really what I mean. But yeah, think about how you can do your fighter maybe a little bit differently. Monks I have kind of a difficult time fitting into D&D fitting into what we normally see in D&D, which is getting less and less common these days, but a very Western medieval feel, quote unquote, to the setting. And monks, just right off the bat, the monk is not based on Christian monks. It's just not, which is really the only sort of monk that would have been in the Western part of the medieval times, right? The monk in D&D is much more concerned, or much more influenced by pulling in Asian cultures, and it's a fun class because it does something different than any other class. And I think, while monk is a good name, they almost should have gone with something like brawler, or I don't know, like, there's no really good term for it, because this can be just the tough guy down at the bar who beats people up with his fists, right? And that would be perfectly fine. Call it a monk. Nobody ever has to talk about the character as if it's a monk. He's he's a fighter, he's a pugilist, he's a boxer, he's a martial artist, whatever you want. He just knows how to kill people with his hands. He or she, they. There are some really fun subclasses for the monk as well. The astral self, I think, is very cool. There's some neat things you can do with that. I've got one of those in a game that I'm running, and it's been cool. Like, they summon up those arms, and it has a really neat effect. It's almost like the character Armor from the X-Men. You know, she summons up this psychokinetic, telekinetic suit of armor that makes her really strong and tough, and that's effectively what the astral self monk is. Drunken Master, I think, is interesting. I don't think it's as good as it needs to be. I think a lot of the monk classes are like that. But again, take a look at how you can play with the expectations. I think a Way of the Open Hand monk who's defined as a bar brawler is perfectly valid. And you shouldn't feel like you need to play a monk who's coming from, you know, the Far East and just happens to be here. It could be anything. A Way of the Shadow monk could just be defined as a thief, right? Or an assassin, something like that. Somebody who's incredibly sneaky, doesn't necessarily have to be referred to as a monk other than when you're talking about it, you know, rules-wise, and could be basically anything. It makes for all sorts of interesting stuff. Same Way of the Four Elements. It could be just somebody like a wizard who is more like a physical adept who's able to tap into the elemental forces and create these different effects. There's all sorts of interesting things you can do with that aren't typical. Paladins are a weird crossover of the fighter and the cleric and the druid, really. And I haven't played a paladin in 5e. I'm tempted to, but I don't know which one I'd like to play. Oath of Vengeance is always the coolest one because it was the coolest one in 4th edition when it was introduced. Because you can mark somebody and you chase them down and you're just unrelenting in getting them. And I like that. I think that's cool. I think it's really, really fun. Oath of Conquest, Oath of Devotion, Oath of Glory, Oath of Redemption. The one that I find super, super interesting is the Oath of the Watchers, which takes the Paladin from being that big, overt, you know, at the front of the battles, shining brightly, fighting things, and turns it into somebody who's more like Giles from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, who was a Watcher. But in this case, the Watcher is specific, or the Paladin is specifically looking for incursions of evil, and they use their powers to track down that information and fight those things. And I think that's a really cool option for a Paladin. Very, very neat. Let's see here. Ranger. Rangers also, because they're so well known, because of characters like Drizzt and or Drizzt, however you want to say it. I say Drizzt, but there you go. People have a specific concept of what that character is, and it's either somebody who uses 2 weapons in combat or uses a bow, and that's fine. Thankfully, they've added a lot of different characterization to the subclasses. So you've got something like the Horizon Walker, who, again, if I'm remembering correctly, looks out for problems coming in from other dimensions and other planes, and I thought that was actually a fantastic thing that they added into the background of Rangers and Druids in 3rd edition, maybe it was 4th edition, I'm pretty sure it was 3rd edition, where they were not just in charge of nature and keeping balance, but they were also in charge. They were also responsible for, or had groups set up so that they would be on the lookout for extraplanar incursions, whether it's demons or the fairy or anything, right? Yugoloths, Githyanki, Githzerai, that sort of thing. Could be anything. Really, really an interesting class role-playing wise, if you don't get stuck in this, Like, oh yeah, I just fight with 2 swords and I shoot my bow, and like, no, there's way more interesting things you can do with the ranger class, and I think it's fantastic. Love the Drake Warden. I think that's a fantastic new option. Give yourself a dragon companion to be by your side. I mean, come on. Everybody should want to play a Drake Warden. Just fantastic. The Gloomstalker, I think, is generally regarded as one of the most powerful of the Ranger options because of the invisibility and darkness, even if you have dark vision. It's a good class. Rangers, I think, initially for 5e, people were very underwhelmed, but I think a lot of the subclasses have really improved the Ranger, not only in terms of their ability to be effective in the game, but also in terms of their story potential. Rogues. So rogues are interesting because rogues, unlike somebody like a bard, and you could also play a bard just like a rogue with magic, so kind of like an arcane trickster. But rogues are interesting because they also fill a specific role, which is the sneaky guy, but also a huge damage dealer. And they have a lot of out of combat options. Tons. They have more out of combat options than any other character class. They're able to open locks, they're able to sneak, they're able to eavesdrop, just everything. If they're not good at it, they're at least able to do something while everybody else sits around because they're either not sneaky or they have disadvantage on their stealth checks or whatever. And then once they're in combat, they do huge damage as long as somebody else is around or they have surprise. Rogues are fantastic characters. I've got a rogue in another game who I specifically wrote up not as a rogue. Well, that's not true. His character class is rogue, but he is a where is it? Not Soul Knife and a scout. He's a scout. And I wrote him up as a member of a mercenary company, and he thinks of himself as a trained fighter and a scout, and that's what he does. He is not a rogue. He doesn't think like a rogue. He doesn't act like a rogue. He's always up in the middle of combat, able to sneak around, able to maneuver and do things that other characters can't do. But he is very much a frontline fighter who is there to support all of his friends and make sure that they have the right information when they're going into a situation so that everybody can handle it. Rogue is just also a fantastic character class for a new player because there are so many different options. If you want to be a good fighter and deal damage, choose a rogue. If you want to be somebody who has access to some magic and is able to fight, play a rogue. Barbarians too. Barbarians are the other big damage dealers in addition to being able to take a lot of damage. Those two classes, if you want to be a fighter in combat that does damage, play a rogue or a barbarian. Those are the two best options. Fighters are much more about control and keeping control of the battlefield and what's going on around them, whereas barbarians are just, I'm going to crush this thing, and I'm going to be able to stand up long enough to do that. Same with the rogue. Rogue hopefully is going to be able to get out of the way, move away, stay out of range of retaliatory attacks by withdrawing and then moving back in to backstab. And it's just a fantastic class for any new player because there are so many different options. And there are some really fun subclasses for the rogue too. Let's see here. Sorcerer. Sorcerer I talked about a little bit. Think of sorcerers like, and in fact you can almost do this for any class, but think of sorcerers like mutants in the Marvel comics, right? They suddenly get these powers from something in their blood, and it's a fantastic class for that. So if you think about your sorcerer coming into their abilities, don't necessarily think of it as magic. Think of it as something else is changing them. It could be anything. You can define it however you want. Just because D&D defines it as shadow magic or a draconic bloodline or storm sorcery. Like, it doesn't need to be that. You could, a storm sorcerer could claim to be, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, the son of a storm god or daughter of a storm god, right? Same thing with any of the other origins. Maybe an aberrant mind is the next step in human evolution, right? It's or whatever race your character is, whatever ancestry your character is. It could just be that's the next step that's going to eventually happen. They have some sort of weird thing that happened to them. There's any sort of thing. Divine soul doesn't necessarily have to be, doesn't even have to conceive of themselves as a sorcerer, right? They could conceive of themselves as a priest. But the way their god is channeling energy through them is as a sorcerer. It has much more offensive capabilities, a little bit of healing ability and clerical abilities, but they are a sorcerer, and they're considered basically an arcane spellcaster. So again, play with the expectation of what you want out of that. Warlocks. Warlocks are easily my favorite class in this edition, and if you watch my little intro video, I have written an entire book on Warlocks. It's not super big. It's 32 pages, something like that. But it has a ton of new patrons and pact boons and new invocations, and there's so many fantastic options for the Warlock. And the Warlock, too, when it was first introduced in 3rd edition, I think people didn't really know what to do with it because it was very much a power gamer's class. And thankfully the rest of the classes have kind of caught up to the Warlock. And in 3rd edition, the Warlock appeared really pretty late. I think it was even in 3.5. And they were able to just fire this D10 of damage every round, which was completely game-breaking when you compare it to something like the Wizard. But now in 5th edition, it's much better, and they've also really played up this relationship with their patron, completely unlike anything except maybe the Cleric, right? I think with Clerics and Warlocks both, GMs sometimes just sort of hand wave the stuff with the patron or with their god, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Again, if you look at something like Critical Role, Ford from the 2nd campaign had just a fantastic and interesting ongoing quote-unquote conversation with his patron, and his patron was not a good guy. Like, did not have his best interests at heart, Ford's best interests, and just wanted things from him. And super interesting. And eventually Ford moved away from him as Uk'otoa as his patron, and I think Uk'otoa was the Fathomless patron, and ended up getting a different patron, still was a warlock, but made a deal with the Wild Mother, I think it was, and still had access to those abilities, and also became a paladin of that new patron. Super interesting, and there's a bunch of great stuff you can do with the warlock, with all these different backgrounds. You could have a character with the undead background who specifically is interested in hunting down and killing the undead, maybe for something in their past. Maybe they are one of the undead. I think it was a lineage, is what it's called, as opposed. So it's not an actual race. You could be like a Dhampir, or you could be a revenant sort of character. But you could actually be actively hunting down other undead, evil undead, things that your patron or you disagree with them existing. Fantastic stuff. I absolutely love the Warlock. I think it's also another great class for a new player because you can always do damage, so you always have something you can do. And you have a little bit of magic with just your couple 3 spell slots, depending on what level you are, and if you have like a Rod of the Pact Keeper. So you don't have so much magic that you have to know all the rules to every single spell as if you were a wizard or even a sorcerer. Warlock is just a fantastic class for a new player. Little complicated, but still very, very good. And then the wizard. I have not yet played a wizard in 5th edition, and it's kind of killing me because, like I said, my favorite thing is to play a magic user in a game that has magic. And there are some really cool, flavorful, fun, and especially powerful wizards that you can play. I think the idea of taking a wizard and having it be treated something more like one of the other classes. So I'm a wizard, but I think I get all of my magic from nature. I mean, that's not a druid, right? That's just a different take on a wizard with different sorts of spells. They have not completely different, but very different spell lists. And I think that's really cool. So if somebody came to me and said, hey, I want to be a wizard, but I'm going to concentrate on, like, I'm going to be the school of, what is it, school of no, is there, what is there? Well, it could be anything. Could be transmutation, could be enchantment, conjuration would make sense. And just, I want my origin, like the way I get my magic to be something different than necessarily studying in books or being taught by another wizard who, you know, put me through as a apprentice over years. You know, play, like I said, and I've said it a number of times, play with the expectations. You have this character that is able to use magic. How did they get that power? Maybe they found an item and it just funneled into them, and now they're trying to learn and figure out what they can do with this energy that they have access to. Maybe a god or some powerful creature, again, kind of like a patron for a warlock, gave them some ability to do magic. Maybe your character is a peace-loving elf from a small community of, you know, tree huggers, and for some reason their god or their something has chosen them to be an evocation specialist, right? Play against type that way. So I'm very peaceful, I'm very calm, but when I go into combat, I'm all about damage. And when I'm out of combat, I try to find the best way to get around things. I'm not interested in blasting you into bits. I'm interested in finding a peaceful solution. But when I have to fight, I am going to end that fight as quickly as possible because that's the type of magic I have. That's what I use. And you can do the opposite too. Like, you could play a character who's very big and buff and like very pushy, a bully, but maybe they have enchantment magic, or maybe they're a diviner, or something else entirely. That doesn't have to. You don't have to match the personality to the magic you're using or to the subclass you're using, and in some cases it's more interesting to go against type and kind of play with expectations that way. It would be so much fun to sit down at a table with 3 or 4 other players and have everybody be role-playing their character and have you forget that, oh yeah, they're playing a wizard, but they don't act like a wizard at all, and they're playing a rogue, but they don't act like a rogue at all. That would be so much fun, because then you're really playing the game instead of the game playing you by forcing you to follow certain expectations about what the game is. So that's all the classes, and that is a pretty good... I'm not going to cover Blood Hunter because it's not an official one. But that's a pretty good recap of the sorts of things that I try to think about when I'm wanting to come up with something new and different. Because I've been playing D&D for 40 years, I always want to try to find something cool and different to do with the classes that I've been familiar with for years and years and years. And this edition allows me to do that, I think, more than any of the previous editions. I think it's similar-ish in the number of options to second edition AD&D that had all the kits and things like that, which I loved, were fantastic. Same thing, third edition had a lot of these options, fourth edition had a lot of these options, but I think in fifth edition they really have gotten to the point where they understand exactly what they want to do, and even if the mechanics from one subclass or one class to another aren't necessarily balanced, and I say that as a game designer who has worked on things like this, and balance is important until it isn't. And we all know what that's like if you've ever run or played in games, because sometimes a character shows up to the table and it is incredibly weak but super interesting. And maybe one of the other players will say, hey, why we should, or the GM will say, why don't we optimize a little bit more, which is understandable. It's really not necessary, though, because going from a +2 to a +3 is only a 5% increase on a d20. It's not a huge amount. So if you have a fighter with a 12 strength, fine, whatever. He's still a fighter, or she's still a fighter. Don't worry about that sort of thing. And then you'll also have people show up to the table who are playing a Sorcerer Warlock because they recover 2 spell slots at every short rest, and so it allows them to cast their Sorcerer spells more often, which makes them more powerful, and they're able to convert their sorcery points into those spell slots even more, and so they have even more spells, and things get unbalanced, and you know how that is. But really, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is have a good time playing with your friends, and if you get caught up in this, it's unbalanced, that's too powerful, that's not good, and there's lots of crosstalk from the players about like, oh man, my character sucks because they're not able to do 36 points of damage in a round. But that's not what your character's built to do. That's not what your character's supposed to do. Your character has some other role that they're supposed to fill, or some other personality they're supposed to bring to the table, and that's what's really important. Obviously, you want to be effective, especially if you're playing, and I'll probably do another video about this, it'll probably be very short, but if you're playing the game as a game, as opposed to the game as a way to tell a story, and what I mean by that is, if you're playing it more like a board game, where, alright, here's the map, we're going to march through 5 feet at a time and maneuver around and fight things, and it doesn't matter that my character has a personality at all, because we're just playing this as a board game. We just want to do something fun, roll some dice, joke around with each other, and move little men around on a map. Fine, little pieces of plastic. That's fine. That's playing it as a game. Playing it as a role-playing game, as a storytelling game, is very different. It can do the same things as a board game, but that's really, the story part of it is really where role-playing games, that's what makes it its own thing. It is completely unique to this type of game. It's always bothered me that they call RPGs, role-playing games, computer role-playing games, with that term, because you're not role-playing. You're clicking. You are not making all the decisions. You are not the one deciding what to say and having a world that reacts back to you based on what you say and do. Your actions are limited. You are not limited in D&D or any role-playing game other than whatever your limitations are for your character. So if you're a human, you're probably not going to be flying around. But if you're an Aarakocra, you will be, or a Kenku, or a fairy. So that's really what makes the game different. And if you are interested in role-playing and getting more and more interesting things out of your characters, try to think about the sort of character you want to play, and then go look at your classes and see how you can sort of filter that idea through the classes to get something really cool and different and unique. I've had so much fun over the years doing exactly that, and it's gotten me some of my most entertaining characters. The noble barbarian, I have absolutely loved playing. I would love to play him again. I'd love to play him in a completely new game. Just start him over at level 1, talk to the GM, let him know what's going on, and just go with it. Same thing with this druid character who treats magic, druidic magic, not as something coming from nature, but as, oh, I'm going to just do this little ritual and do this thing with these components, and it has this effect. That's just what it does for him. And it's just been a blast. So hopefully this is helpful to you. If you have examples of characters that are unlike what's normally expected from their class, I'd love to hear about it, because that is just so much fun. And I hope some of the ideas I provided here are inspirational for you or informative. I think one of the things I most like to do when talking about gaming is to provide ideas that then inspire people to do other things. And it doesn't have to be a whole bunch of inspiration, right? Like, just think about things a little bit differently, and that's all I'm really looking for, and that's what I like to do. There you go. I hope you enjoyed this. I had a good time doing it. I went on for way longer than I thought I was going to, but also not as long as I could have. And now I'm going to go find some food. So, hey, we'll see you next time. Stand by for adventure.